Good evening. It's 6:05 Central Time, and Nick Verma and I want to welcome you to our 1 hour cocktail hour. And I hope all of you guys have your favorite drink in hand. I don't necessarily have my favorite drink, but I have my COVID drink, so I'll share it with you. Those of you who know me, I do like wine. I don't always know always how to pick it, but I do have a glass of red wine. Nick, are you drinking something?
Yeah, I've got a Spanish red called Clio, highly recommended.
Okay, so I have a box of Costco wine. Okay, if any of you are interested, this is the Kirkland brand, and it holds 4 bottles, and it's $14, and it's the best box wine I've ever had in my life. And it's very good because if you ever need a refill, you just pour it out of the spigot. So it's like going to a water cooler, and I think it's very appropriate. So Emily and I have basically our wine cellar is now full of boxes because I pretty much have gone through all of our other wine that we've collected over the years. So box wine is working just fine for us. So listen, I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight. I know there was a barrage of emails, but Nick and I were really kind of hell-bent on having us get together. This is a webinar that's also sponsored by Kaibo Medical. We're really grateful to them for doing this. They were very generous, and it allowed me to get my box of wine. So I'm very happy about that, although I suspect Nick is drinking much more higher end than I am. You guys spent the time to put a bunch of questions in. I know we had a couple hundred people sign up. This is really not meant to be an academic lecture or other. I think I sort of feel like all of us in many ways are suffering from social disconnect, and I realize that this is not something that's going to fill that void, but we thought it would be really nice for all of us to get together. We also recognize that there are a large number of our former fellows, and we'll have some of the conversation. Nick and I put together just 3 points we wanted to talk about, and they somewhat play off the questions that you guys provided. And then answer some questions, and then you'll have the opportunity through the chat feature. I'll stop sharing my screen. I think Nick and I will be able to see the chat feature to ask questions. And we have an hour to do this. And look, if any of you guys want to follow up with Nick or myself, you can always do that by email. We welcome that. One of the reasons Nick and I elected to pair with one another is, as you know, Nick, or you may not know, but Nick is program chair for the annual meeting. This year's annual meeting didn't happen. We had some virtual format of it. We have an annual meeting scheduled for April of next year, which we're honestly discussing the dates. I'm president of AANA this year. I've been on the board for a long time, and it's been honestly a true honor to serve. I got involved with AANA a long time ago, primarily because it offered me opportunity when I was very young, when I first came out of fellowship. And I think that's one of the major attributes of this organization, is that there's not a lot of ego involved. It's a very pragmatic, practical organization. And there's a lot of value to its membership besides the journal. And that's something that I've been focusing on this year, is member engagement, mentorship, and helping young people find opportunities to get involved. And to that end, I really would like to extend a plea for all of you to sign up for AANA if you're not signed up as members. I know some of our former fellows have not, and it would be really important. I think good for you. There's some incredible value to being a member based upon some initiatives we're doing that are practice building initiatives on the business side. And also obviously the journal and some of the other value added prospects that the organization delivers. So I just encourage all of you, if you're not active members, please sign up and become an active member. If not, I will hunt you down. And those of you who have operated with me in the operating room, I can do that. I'm not very tall, but I've got a big bite. So Nick, I give you a chance to speak up now, and I'm glad that you and I get to do this. It's a lot of fun for me. So thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Brian. Cheers, and cheers to everybody who's with us in the audience today. I think that this is a really unique opportunity, and we said goodbye to our graduating fellows about a week ago. And one of the things that I thought about in seeing them go is how COVID has really impacted us. And I think for all the negative aspects that have happened with COVID, one of the positive aspects is that we figured out how to do things like this, which is to connect with one another, to learn from one another, to help provide leadership and mentorship to one another. And I think that's really what specialty societies like AANA are all about, is helping to support each other in these difficult times, particularly when we're all learning together how to navigate a crisis such as this one. So this ability to kind of come to you from our living room to your living room or your office or wherever you are is a unique one. And I think something that would have been of huge benefit to Brian and I, for sure, when we were young attendings in practice or during our fellowship. So I want to thank you for spending an hour with us this evening. Hopefully you've got a nice cocktail to join with. As Brian said, the chat is open. We also have the question and answer segment open, so you can use either one, whichever one is most convenient for you, but we'd certainly like to hear your comments and questions. Brian and I talked last night about putting together kind of a strategy to get through this, as we only have an hour and there's certainly multiple topics we could cover. We're going to try to stay away from true medicine topics. So, debating meniscal transplant versus meniscectomy and those types of things. We're really going to focus today on things like fellowship and residency and training, how to get the most out of that, and what tips we give to people in that setting, how to develop your practice early on, and some of the things we've learned along the way, some of our tips and pearls about practice development, including the business aspect of practice. And then we'll touch briefly on COVID topics, how it's affected us personally, how it affects things like team coverage or sports coverage, and where do we see this going in the future in terms of the way we practice orthopedic sports medicine. So I think that'll take us through the hour. Again, please submit your questions along the way. Just to give you a little bit of background about me, as Brian said, we're both together at Rush. I oversee our sports medicine and shoulder division, as well as overseeing, along with Shane No, our fellowship. So this concept of mentorship and young physician development is one that's been really near and dear to the hearts of all of our attending staff at Rush, and something that we're very proud of in terms of the way that we've helped to develop young surgeons across the country and frankly across the world. So we're really excited to continue that concept today and just share with you some of our thoughts and pearls about practice development.
So thanks, Nick. And as you may or may not know, especially to our former fellows, I've become the managing partner of Midwest Orthopedics. It's been an incredible ride over the last 2 years. Chuck Bush-Joseph had that job for about 15 years. And it's been actually really gratifying. Nick and I both are on the executive committee at MOR, and we've been very involved in helping maintain the practice through a really difficult time. But I can tell you, I've learned more in the last 6 months than I think I've ever accumulated business-wise throughout the last 25 years, including business school. This has been an incredible experience, and thankfully things, we're all healthy. I'm hoping that all of you are healthy and your families are healthy that are on this call. And we'll talk about some of the issues as it relates to COVID and running a practice, because I think maybe you have attended some of the other webinars that we've been involved with. We had a great one with Rothman and Ortho Carolina, where we covered some of the strategies to sort of rein it in, austerity, and then emerging and living with COVID in a way where we may expect sort of reduced revenues and reduced business going forward. So, and anyway, thanks again for joining us, Nick. Why don't you, let's start with the first topic that we had. We only picked 3, and we want to keep it kind of brief and high level. And then, maybe around 6:30, it's 6:13 now, around 6:30, we'll start going through some of the questions and then keep our eye in the chat room.
Great. So Brian, the first topic is around fellowship, and I'll let you take the first question and then I'll chime in. The first thing we want to cover is really not only for fellowship, but let's talk about residency/fellowship for young people who are developing their careers, looking towards a career in arthroscopy and sports medicine, and maybe even touch on a little bit about how this year may differ based on the COVID crisis. But what advice would you give to somebody who's just starting out in their fellowship or late in their residency about things to do to set themselves up to a successful future, and how to get the most out of their training?
Well, of course, the answer has to be grounded a little bit in what's going on with COVID. But I think, look, at this juncture, all of us have accepted the fact that we will live with COVID, and there's a general perception that perhaps by May, June, or July, we'll be, God willing, done with this. So a lot of this is transitional. I remember when things started happening in March, April transition, Stephanie Wong, who I hope Stephanie's on the call, was my fellow at the time. And it was really unnerving. We all were going through this together, and we didn't know who to be around, how close to be, how this thing was even transmitted. And there was so much uncertainty, and then things shut down with no elective surgery. We've blown through that. And while it was very stressful, I think we're in a new place now that while we don't have clarity in terms of endpoints, we have a good idea of what life is going to be like, I think, between now and I'll just say over the next year till June and July. And from a resident or fellow perspective, I think it's kind of business as usual. Frankly, job search may be compromised a bit because, frankly, I can just give you, from our perspective at MOR, we have been concerned about volumes, and we've been watching them very closely. And we're sitting now at about, say, 90% of revenues and maybe 75% of our practice. And I think the challenges are, people often say that healthcare is recession proof. I think healthcare is recession proof, but we're not insensitive to the forces that normally deliver patients to our front door. So arguably in your practices, if you guys are out, those who have chosen arthroplasty or other, for example, they are seeing different forces than we see in sports. And I would argue most of the people on this Zoom call are going to be in sort of doing what Nick and I do in sort of sports and arthroscopy and so forth. And I think we have a little bit of a different challenge. What comes in the office now is different, and I think it's going to be different for some time. The forces that will guide job availability include the fact that we have millions of people without insurance. We have lots of people who will be uninsured. We have lots of people who will be out of work or starting new jobs. They're going to learn to live with their ailments, if you will. And let's face it, pain and suffering are very subjective, and patients, based on other forces, may decide they want to care for those things or not. And then add on top of that, the reason people come to us is because they do something that aggravates their underlying condition and they become symptomatic. And we're not seeing that as much. We're not seeing, obviously, the ACL tears, the shoulder dislocations, and so forth. We're seeing more degenerative phenomena, longer standing things that people say, I kind of have time now, I'm going to get it taken care of. But it's very clear that the demographic epidemiology of what you and I are going to see is going to be different in the near term. And as far as job availability, I would argue that there is going to be some challenges. I think small groups, just like restaurants, are struggling. The cost, it's like the analogy I give is that it's like opening a ski mountain. If you want to put one person up, you can get 1,000 people up or one person up, but you still have to have the same construct up and running with all the people, all the lifts and all the food and all the beverage, everything else. We are kind of the same thing. To open your doors, you have to, there's an enormous expense structure, and the small groups are clearly at more risk because they were already functioning on the margin. So I would argue, if you're new and coming out, find secure pathways. That might be a hospital setting. That might be being an employed physician. That may be a contract that you might look very carefully, say at a force majeure, what that actually looks like in terms of their ability to pay you or not pay you. You got to kind of protect yourself in the coming year, given the uncertainty. Again, it's not about the recession. It's about the nature of the business. And I think we're going to see a little bit of a reduction in terms of what walks in our office, and that falls to the bottom line of any group that's going to hire you. So I think be in tune with those issues, because it's different. This year is going to be different, those of you who are coming out, than it has been up to date based upon those forces. Nick, anything else to add on that?
No, I think, you made some great points that relate to COVID itself. I would just, I guess, take a step back and just give people on this call the same advice that I give our fellows that come in that, fellowship is a really accelerated learning process, and it's much different than a residency process. In residency, most of what you do is transactional. You see somebody in the ER, you put a splint on, you hand their x-rays to the next guy in the morning, and then, what happens after that is really not up to you. It goes to the hand service and they decide what to do, and you really are washing your hands of it. Fellowship is really about learning how to be a physician. It's about learning techniques, it's about learning skills, but in large part, it's about learning how to take that next step and become responsible for the patient care that we deliver on a day in and day out basis. And so what I would suggest to you is that, even though volumes may be slightly down, or the way that we practice may change a little bit, or sports coverage, as Brian alluded to, may be a little bit different, you still have a wealth of knowledge for the people that are running your program, for the extending staff that are available. And much of what you need to learn, despite the fact that you think, wow, I got to really be the first guy on that case in order to learn it, you'll realize pretty quickly that the skill set in terms of the way that you move your hands, or the technical aspects of how you do surgery, those are things that we all pick up pretty quickly. That's how we got to be where we are. But much of what we need to learn to be successful is decision-making and pearls and pitfalls about how to get yourself into a position for success, and how to keep yourself out of trouble, or get out of trouble when you find yourself in it. And so for me, the example that I often give is, when I was a junior guy in practice, maybe a year out or so, I would do a case or two a day. I wasn't that busy. I was just building my practice. But at the end of my case, I would just walk over to the next room, and I'd see Brian, or I'd see Tony Romeo at the time, or Chuck Bush Joseph. And I would just stand in the back of their room, and I would watch, because I would recognize that there were parts of a case that I would do that I struggled with. And I didn't need to do the case. I didn't need to be scrubbed with them, but I could just watch what they were doing and understand why I struggled and what they were doing differently to make their lives easier. Whether that was just the positioning of the patient, the portal that they had the scope in, the sequence of events that they did things in. Those are the things that you learn when you're not doing the case, that are actually easier to learn as an observer than they are as an actual person doing the case, that are going to make you better over time. So I think if you're worried about case volumes, for example, go watch in a room, stand in the back and be an observer and take notes about things that you don't pick up when you're the actual surgeon. Patient positioning, how they're managing, the portal position, all the little things that go into making somebody a technically smooth surgeon versus somebody who takes a little bit more time. So that's my first tip, is take advantage of the opportunities that are in front of you. I think one of the areas that may be difficult this year is learning the sports coverage side. That certainly is a skill that can be gained from spending time around teams and being responsible for teams. And admittedly, we just don't have the ability to do that right now. So I think that this is an area where specialty societies such as AANA and AOSSM, as well as things that Brian and I do within our fellowship and elsewhere, that we're really going to have to do a very good job of picking up on the didactic side and helping you to learn it on the fly. The reality is that's also things that you learn as you become a young surgeon and young physician in practice. And that's a great opportunity when you have the opportunity to be with mentors. And when you start out, it's okay to be second in line for a high school physician and just going to them with games, understanding how they communicate with the trainers, how they communicate with the players, how they make game time decisions. These are things that I still learn today, even when I talk to my colleagues who have been doing it a lot longer than I've been doing it. So I do think that that's an area that we're going to have to concentrate on. We're going to have to supplement on the didactic side, but that's a process that you'll continue to learn throughout your career. And I don't think it's going to be a situation where if you miss a little bit of it this year, you can't make it up in the future.
Yeah, one thing I might add is I know that we don't just have young people and fellows here. We have a wide age range of individuals, but just an additional comment. I don't think the volume constraints are going to really impact an educational experience this year. And I think you'll gain some things because you'll have potentially more time to absorb some of the really important things. And Nick made some great points. The focus on doing is probably less important than the focus on seeing, watching, learning, and decision-making. And those of you who are residents or fellows, clearly the most important aspect of your fellowship is going to be the decision-making in the office. The technical aspects, learn as much as you can, learn from the mistakes of others and the challenges, and put that in your database. But look around you. It's sort of like having a smorgasbord of individuals and say, I want to learn this from this individual. You don't have to emulate everything from all your different mentors. You may find a quality in one, you'll find another quality in another, and you sort of meld it together that sort of creates you. The blessing, the hidden thing that's come from the current time that I've seen, and I know Nick has articulated this as well, I will tell you that while my office volumes are a little down, and we're doing that by intent just to create space, we're still doing about a third of our practice intentionally by telemedicine, things that can easily be done by telemedicine. I will tell you that the first thing was that all of us felt, those of us who are restricted from doing surgery and seeing patients, all of a sudden when it was taken away from you, the first thing was, oh my God, the feeling of not being able to do what you love doing. Because you ask any of us on the Zoom call, we do this, so we did this, or we chose this because we truly want to help people. That never goes away, no matter how bad things are. When someone comes in your office and has a good outcome and was really problematic to begin with, that feeling never, ever goes away. And the fact is, I'm finding myself able to spend more time with my patients now and have like really good conversations. And maybe I'm just craving more social contacts. I'm not getting it elsewhere, but I feel like I'm a much better doctor now and a much sort of better person in front of my patients and with my patients now than ever before. And I bet a lot of people on this call are feeling the exact same thing. As soon as it was taken away, we're very fortunate that we're back doing what we're doing. You just think about the millions of people who are not able to do their craft, their trade, including athletes, but all the way down the line, there's, even the very simple stuff. And we are very, very fortunate. So we sort of have a first world problem on our hand, but I think this is embrace the change and take the time now, if you have the extra time, to ask your patients things about their family, to, what do they do? What's happening with school? What's happening with their kids' school? Is everyone working? Is everyone healthy? Those can be 5 to 8 minute conversations that are actually really gratifying for you personally. And as far as the patient's perception, obviously, how much that means to them, because it's not just about their knee pain or their shoulder pain. But I'm pretty optimistic about this year of education, Nick. I think that everyone's going to get a good experience because we know the run rate right now, and God willing, as long as we're not shut down and get rid of elective, I think we can do a very good job sort of training the next generation.
Yeah, and I think the reality is we can make most people proficient in about half the time that we do. So even if there is a slight reduction, I don't think it's going to impact the educational quality or their proficiency of the surgeons as they leave fellowship. The other point I wanted to touch on is to just give people a little bit of advice, especially given the time of year where those who are fellows on the call are just starting. about all of the things that you want to pay attention to outside of just the medical side. You know, fellowship is a little bit like drinking from a fire hose. You think that a year is a long period of time, but it's really not, and it goes by amazingly quickly. And you've got a lot on your plate in terms of trying to, you know, balance your what you need to do to complete your fellowship and make sure your attendings are happy. You're looking at academic sides and research type things. The job search is often a big portion of this year for a lot of people and takes up a lot of their time and weighs on them. But Brian, you can comment on this too, but some of the other things that I think it's important that you learn during this year that's different from a residency status is all of the things that we do outside of medicine and surgery. So how do we run our practices? How do we structure our office staff? How do we utilize our ancillary assistants, our physician extenders? How do we do some of the marketing things we do? How do we balance our work-life environment? How do we get started in academics, and what are the roles that we play in academics? You know, team physician and coverage in terms of establishing those relationships, and how do we navigate that aspect? The business side of medicine, for those of you that are in a practice that is a private practice environment, and even for those of you that are in a practice that's more hospital-based where your attendings are employed physicians, is understanding what they've learned about those experiences over time, so that you can maybe be a step ahead of the game when it comes time to look at different contracts and opportunities for you. So it's hard to do, and I know it often takes a back seat during a fellowship process where you're really focused on, I need to learn how to do an SCR, or you know, I've got to figure out this this technique that I really want to learn for Latarjet. But these are things that really come down to the mentorship aspect of fellowship that is, again, in my mind, different than what you learn during residency. And you have a lot of people in front of you that have a ton of experience and have maybe come from 2 or 3 different places where they've experienced different aspects of employment, or primary care to an private practice to an employed physician, or vice versa. And they can give you a lot of advice about what they've learned along the way. And they've gotten to a position where they are because they've been successful to some degree. And so I think it's really important that you take a step back and try to take as much of that in as you can, in addition to learning the medicine side of sports medicine. Brian, thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, you know, the hardest part for all of us is sort of balancing family, professional life, and within professional life, it's administrative, office, surgery, and various roles that you may take from a leadership perspective, and then just managing your own personal practice, whether it's social media, outreach, covering teams, the philanthropy that you do. Some of the general things that I have found that have been most beneficial to me have been to dedicate time slots. When I became managing partner, I found one of the greatest time management things that I was able to engage in was having 2 days a week where I start late and I can take calls and get those off the slate. And Monday morning is a good one because so much happens between Friday and Monday, and you can sort of start out with a fresh week if you have time on Monday. So those of you who have a number of sort of concomitant administrative responsibilities, I found that to be particularly helpful. And then I do it again later in the week on Thursdays. But all the while, you know, I still need to work. I still need to see patients, do surgery, and those are things I love to do. But allotting blocks of time to actually do things that things can't bleed into it are particularly important. The other thing that's been particularly helpful for me, and I know Nick and I have been pretty good at this, is allocating time to work out and to recreate, especially now. That's been really critical. So finding a time that you can block for yourself, that nobody takes away, that nothing sort of creeps into, that you can take care of yourself. Certainly if you cannot take care of yourself, you're not taking care of yourself, you're gonna have a much more difficult time managing all the tasks at hand.
Yeah.
The other thing is that sort of this concept of surrounding yourself with excellence, and then handling those people well. Nick and I each have a pretty significant team of people around us, but they're all really, really motivated. They know they're appreciated, and we try to align their goals and expectations with what we can provide them and make sure that when we do delegate, we actually follow up. So some of the things that have helped us significantly, even at Rush, every Monday night, we have a research meeting at 4:30 and we have an amazing turnout, and it's multi-specialty within sports. And we are always trying to get an understanding of what people are trying to get out of their efforts. You know, obviously people want to sort of many people want to get more involved with teaching, education, and so forth. They want to be first author. They want to be acknowledged. They want to be on the podium. And there's no shame in sort of identifying those things and helping people achieve those goals. You know, at some point, there's enough room at the podium, and all of us have to be willing to step aside and make room for others. And that's, ironically, that's what ties back to AANA, which is this mentorship concept to help allow others to enjoy some of the same things that we've been really blessed and fortunate to do. Bottom line is surround yourself by people who are better than you and by enough of them. And part of the reason I love doing what I do is because I'm involved around young people that not only can teach me about great things like music and pop culture and a great way to make a margarita, but also they ask challenging questions and you understand where they are in the nature of their career. And it's really fun. And doing what we do can be a lot of fun, even now at a time of stress, if you surround yourself by great people and understand what their expectations are. So responsible delegation is sort of the name, the theme of the day right now. Surrounding yourself by great people, understanding what their needs and expectations are, and rewarding them for their efforts properly, and never losing sight of that, and giving them a voice. And I think we've learned that over time. Our program has, I think, become great because we've taken the time to take a deep breath and say, what are we trying to achieve? How can we collaborate and achieve all of our collective efforts, and recognize that people are working very, very hard, and at the same time be willing to put our egos aside, move over and let other people achieve their goals and aspirations too. It just makes all of us better collectively. And I think that's the lessons we've learned. And I have to commend Nick. Nick has really took over the research efforts. It's not about Rush or MOR. That's an example that we learned the hard way, but we learned it and we changed. And the fruits of our labor are pretty apparent. And you see a lot of names, a lot of people, a lot of our former fellows are still engaged in delivering, and they're able to do the things they want to do because they have learned how to actually get this done. So those are just a couple of my thoughts as parlaying from what Nick was saying.
Yeah, great. So one of the other questions that we were asked a lot, and that came up on our list as well, is job selection and how do you choose a job moving forward. That's obviously first and foremost on many people's minds at this time of the year when fellowships are beginning. Couple thoughts here that I often share with our younger fellows is the first thing that you need to do is to recognize that the biggest thing about job selection and contract negotiation is downside protection. As much as we all hope that the job that we get is going to be our forever job and that it's going to be perfect and work out the way that we want it to, the reality is that for a large percentage of us, that may not be the case. And we may find that for whatever reason, family reason, professional reasons, a host of others, that we decide to make a change at some point in our career. And that's often the most difficult time in a professional career, is when you're leaving one job and starting another, and terminating a contract can be fraught with potential complications. I think that one of the important things to do is to really understand what are the upsides and downsides of each of the different models for practice. Obviously, the upside of a employed position is that you get basically a very well-defined compensation. It's obviously most oftentimes based on some form of either collections or now more commonly an RVU metric, which basically means that for the work you do, you get compensated at a fixed rate. The nice thing about the RVU metric is that it takes all of the other fluff out of the equation. It doesn't matter whether you're treating a governmental player or a private insurance payer or a workers' compensation patient, for example. You get paid the same. You just do the work and you get compensated for it. The limitations of a employed model are generally that it's a black box situation. What I mean by that is that many things that exist outside of your basic patient care delivery are outside of your control. And so these are things like the scheduling process, the front desk people, how they check in and check out patients. What are the policies when patients show up late? How do you get a patient that's got an acute ACL tear to make sure they get on your schedule the next day, instead of going through a centralized scheduling process where they are told that there's no opening for 2 weeks? The billings and collection process can be outside of your hands and often outside of your purview, such that you can't understand, nor can you really do a good job of evaluating whether the hospital or the health system that's in charge of the billing collections is actually doing an appropriate job in making sure that they're collecting on the dollars that you bring. And then finally, it's often difficult for you to realize the benefits of the total value that you bring to the hospital or the healthcare system, right? Because what we do as orthopedic surgeons, a small percentage of that is the actual professional fees that we generate. A much larger percentage of that is all of the vertical services that come along with orthopedic care, which are things like radiology, MRI, CT scan, physical therapy, occupational therapy, splinting, casting, DME, facility fees, et cetera. Those are in large part where the value of an orthopedic surgeon to a hospital or a health system is multiple times more their value in just generating the professional fees from the services they deliver. The upside of obviously a private practice model is that you potentially have advantages to access some of those verticals or ancillary care models, depending on the type of practice that you're in. You can in large part structure the practice the way that you want. You have definitely much more control over all of the different people that interface with your patients, whether that's your admin, your MAs, your PAs, your front desk staff, your scheduling service, et cetera. The downside is that in a private practice model, you've got to build it. So there's a little bit more risk in terms of your ability to generate business, to build a practice, to take on financial risk at the onset when your practice is still growing or relatively immature. Whereas in a hospital-based system, much of the referrals that you get are often turnkey because they've got a built-in primary care network that can start to feed you. And regardless of whether you're not busy at the beginning, you've got a guaranteed income that's somewhere between 3 to 5 years on a run rate. The other thing that's important to recognize is that it's very important to get appropriate legal consultation at the time that you sign a contract. You really have, there's so many pearls and pitfalls about contract language that are very difficult for us to understand, even when you read the contract yourself. And a good legal opinion, somebody who is specifically has an expertise in medical professional contracts will know all of the ways to keep you out of trouble and to make sure what's being offered to you is fair and market, regarding not only how do you get into the contract and how you paid, but what happens if that contract terminates and how do you leave and who handles all of the limitations on where you can practice and what are your responsibilities and what are your costs going to be if that practice doesn't work out or that hospital employment system doesn't work out. So it's very important that you get that legal advice up front. I think as Brian said, you know, the COVID situation certainly throws a wrench in the plans a little bit. And I think the biggest thing here is to make sure that when you're looking at a practice, you're not only evaluating the position that you're being hired for, but you really want to kind of do an in-depth determination of what's the overall fiscal health of that practice and their ability to navigate a downturn such as the COVID crisis, and what does that look like over the short term, 12 to 24 months. You know, where we see people getting into trouble with primarily with private practice enterprises is they really don't understand what the structure of the practice is beyond the employment term. So for us at Midwest Orthopedics, we generally have a defined employment term after which most of our orthopedic surgeons become eligible for a partnership model. You really need to understand what that partnership model looks like, because when you're looking at a practice, yeah, we like to look at what does it look like over 2 years or 5 years and what's my compensation. But the reality is if you join a practice and leave at 5 years, you're not taking away your income over that first 5 years. You're taking away income over the primary portion of your career. So you're taking income away from the mid portion or the later portion where you're going to be at your highest earning potential. So you think about lost 5 years, the lost 5 years at the mid portion of someone's practice can amount to a significant amount of dollars. So when you join a private practice, you not only want to know what your initial contract looks like, but you want to know what does my partnership contract look like? How is my buy-in going to be calculated? What does the other members of that practice or that department look like, and how is their compensation calculated? What is my ancillary opportunity and what does my buy-in look like for each of the service lines that the practice may hold? And a good practice, private practice that's going to be transparent is going to give you that information up front. And they may not be able to tell you the number that it's going to be in 2 years or 3 years, but they'll at least be able to define for you the formula that's going to be used so that any qualified accountant or attorney at the time of a partnership decision can go back to that formula and come up with a relatively similar calculation to what your practice looks like. So, you know, those are just a couple high-level views about what I think about practice management and job selection. Brian, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, this could be a whole couple of hours, and we're not going to, but you made some really great points. Truth be told, I think still probably for the next year, we'll still see 70% of jobs taken are going to be private practice, not hospital-based. Orthopedics still enjoys probably as a subspecialty, the largest number of non-hospital-based jobs year after year. That being said, if you're faced with an RVU contract, I think you got to be a little bit careful. We tend to estimate how much value we bring to the hospital system. And RVU-based contracts are often very favorable initially, and then they get you, and then either 3 or 5 years later, it's complete renegotiation. And there's a lot of problems with RVU-based contracts because they don't always correlate with how reimbursements occur. So your work effort, for example, doesn't actually tag directly to reimbursement when you're calculating all RVUs. So there's a lot of hidden things when they're RVU-based contracts, just things you need to be careful of. It's not a bad contract. It's just something you need to really think about because it's not dollar for dollar. You know, why do hospitals want to hire you? I'll tell you why they want to hire you. They want to hire you for the same reasons that we've come to realize how practice stays viable. We have learned that essentially to manage the indirect overhead of a organization, you need to just see patients and do surgery. And once you do that, that's just very basic compensation to keep the lights on. We've also recognized that having multi-specialty, maybe a directed network, which you may or may not have, certainly having excellence and reputation, but having the verticals that Nick alluded to are really the main way to maintain compensation. That's why hospitals want you, because they capture the verticals. If you're working for a hospital, you don't. So if you're making a salary of some sort, that salary is probably covered by your professional revenues, but that pales into comparison to the value that you bring to the hospital system. What Nick and I have learned in our group is that the dollar value, the compensation, the value in general of the organization is really predicated not on how many surgeries you do, not on how many patients you see, but rather the collective bundle that you can actually own and organize with that specific patient. So that's everything from DME, may include pharmacy, it may include PT, OT, MRI, X-ray, CT, sports performance. All of those ancillary things that others have actually been collecting, those are the things that if you're in private practice, you want to control. So it speaks to the fact that when you're looking at a group, a small group is a very challenging environment today and yesterday, and I would argue even tomorrow. A small group is a very difficult business organization. So whatever jobs you guys are contemplating or the situation you're currently in, the smaller the group, the bigger challenges you're going to have. And it also becomes very difficult to tackle any efficiencies. So just things to think about. One of the questions that came in was about, I alluded to the fact that we, in our research efforts, and there's a lot of questions are coming in about research, which is great. What were some of the challenges we had? I think the biggest challenges we had were that people were just disenfranchised and not feeling recognized for their efforts. And we had very little organizational oversight. So we invested in human capital to organize our research efforts. So people to manage FDA trials, people to manage investigator-initiated trials, and to manage the budgetary aspects, the IRB aspects, the outcomes initiatives. We've recently deployed Patient IQ, which has been pretty amazing at managing all of our research efforts and marries to our EHR, which we currently use Athena from an outcomes perspective. And how do we fix it when we recognize that people were disenfranchised, it was poorly organized? We got human capital and we had regular meetings and we made sure we clearly understood projects that were ongoing, that weren't going awry. And we understood every project that was suggested. We were critical of the ones that really had no legs, that weren't just pet projects. And we managed our resources properly. And most importantly, we really addressed the issues pertaining to ego very early and made sure that we were sharing recognition across the board, and people were not afraid to speak up to say they were or were not being recognized for their efforts. And that's how we fixed it. There was another question that came in about how to sort of in this time where academic jobs are maybe becoming more scarce and more difficult because academic jobs typically have a different economy. They're funded by professional fees, not necessarily directly by all the runoff ancillaries that we're talking about. So keep in mind that it may be a challenge right now for academic jobs. I know we've been sort of trying to figure out what tomorrow's going to look like. I don't think this is a permanent thing, but AANA is a great example of how those who are in private practice can get involved academically. And I would tell you, this is one of our missions right now in our practice service organization initiative. We have a research portion of our site that will have clinical trials that you can become involved with as a clinician. There are a number of investigator-initiated trials that you can get funding for. I would say that the lowest hanging fruit is outcomes. So if you have an area of subspecialization where you have sufficient volume, you got to collect outcomes. So turning to things like Patient IQ or SOS and so forth, so that you can collect outcomes early on. There's no barrier to entry when it comes to being involved with academics, but you certainly have to observe all the issues that are required, such as IRB, the infrastructure, and so forth. But anyone can do it. And if you guys are struggling, this could be an offline conversation, but I'm telling you, anyone can do this. You don't have to have an academic institution behind you. And I would argue, and Nick and I would probably tell you that the institution has provided more obstacles than facilitating our progression in research. We've been able to do it. We do function like a private practice when it comes to research, but in the background is an academic institution, which, it has its own challenges. Nick, do you want to go to some of the other questions we had?
Yeah, we just touch on what you're saying, Brian. You know, what's amazing about orthopedics is some of the guys who have become very proficient in either research or education come from the private practice world, right? Jim Esch comes to mind in terms of his development of San Diego shoulder. Never had a big academic affiliation, but managed to do what was important to him and get it done. And Jack Farr is a guy who comes to mind on the research side, who's been very prolific in terms of getting things done and lives in a completely private practice environment. So I don't think that you have to go to an academic position to be academic in the way that that defines you, whether that's education, research, or team coverage, other things that we do.
Yeah.
So that's number one. Number two is the other question that we got was, what do we think is the future of private practice and what does that look like to us? I'll just answer personally for me, I'm extremely bullish on the future of orthopedic private practice. And I think the investment that we're seeing on private equity sides and elsewhere would say that there are a lot of people are betting on the successes of private practice. And I think when we think about what's going to be successful for an orthopedic physician, an orthopedic group, an orthopedic department, an orthopedic practice going forward, it's going to be based on quality, cost, and outcomes. That's really the name of the game moving forward. And I think if you check each of those boxes, a private practice wins all day long over a hospital system. A hospital system has to be everything to all people. They've got to be available to take care of the appendectomy in the middle of the night and then turn around and do the hip replacement the next morning. A private practice, on the other hand, can be a super specialty shop. We can be the Jiffy Lube where all we do is oil changes over and over, and we can do it for $21.95 and make sure that it gets done correctly. And I think that when we control the verticals, when we control the facility side in orthopedic specialty centers, when we control the imaging side, when we control the DME, when we control the physical therapy, our ability to get patients the care that they need, to get it to them in an efficient, timely manner, to control costs when applicable, and to make sure that our quality metrics meet or exceed the standard of care, we can do that much better than the hospital can, because that's our sole focus. That's our sweet spot. That's our nuance. So to me, I think that private practices that take advantage of that, private practices that build specialty networks and focus on quality and cost are going to be really the way that orthopedics develops in the future. And I think that that's something to look at as you start to join practices, is what's their ability to create a system-based approach to practicing orthopedic medicine, because I think that's where the success is going forward. So that's just my 2 cents on private practice. You know, to follow up on Brian's research comment, I think the biggest thing that we did on a research perspective is we took it from a siloed approach where it was done individually, and we made it a division-based approach. And we did that by centralizing the way that research was done. We did that by making sure that we were inclusive in terms of anybody wanted to show up and participate was involved. And we did that by making sure that we shared the, I don't know what the word is, the accolades, or shared the, basically the productivity amongst all that were participating. And I think once you do that, you find that the sum is once again much greater than the parts as individuals. And I think for me, that was one of the ways to be successful early on, is to come into a group and say, I don't need to be overly successful as an individual, but if I can bring the group together and make sure that we're all better, more successful as a group, that we're in the end, our individual success is going to grow as well. And so that would be my advice to young people going in, is try to be the glue that brings the group together in terms of bringing people into the same page and collaborating on research and working together, because the sum of all parts will certainly be bigger than the individual.
Nick, we had a lot of, switching gears a little bit, we had a lot of questions related to management of COVID in sports. It was amazing.
Yep.
I'd say half the questions related to that. And Nick and I have sort of been at the epicenter of this. In fact, right after this call, I go on a call with the NBA. Nick was very involved with the MLB in terms of developing their program. They're not really functioning like the M.B.A. is, in a quote bubble, but they've done extremely well. And virtually every protocol that's been out there has relied on testing. It's impossible to have a return to sport program without testing. And as you guys have probably just heard, you know, basically all of college football is going to be at least postponed to the spring. I think the bottom line is that what people recognize is that any aspect of our society that has reined it in has resulted in not necessarily reduced positivity, because positivity rates are largely related to how frequently we're testing, not to sound like you know who, but more importantly, the ability to avoid overwhelming the hospital system has been directly proportional to how open various systems are. And we're going to learn a lot over the next 4 weeks when we see what happens in colleges. if it becomes overwhelming, despite contact tracing and everything else, my sense is that there will be very few colleges that will be um, in person, and most will be going remote. And I think the main reason is not because we're so fearful that these young people are going to get sick, but rather these young people will lead to the downturn in the hospital system and their capacity. As it relates to sports, it's really sort of a microcosm of the same thing that's happened at the college level. There are certain sports that I think will do okay, but if they're high school sports, for example, like tennis or swimming, which are more likely they're obviously non-contact, likely to open, and there's been a big shift to the spring for all the other contact sports. As soon as they have problems because of the other social interactions, those two are probably going to shut down because we're just trying to maintain the positivity rate at some level, whether it's 15 per 100,000 or other. It's going to be very difficult for us to see contact sports come online. Really, the only ones who have been truly successful are those that have had ample use, very liberal use of testing, and that's not going to be college, not going to be high school. And the ideal situation is what the NBA has done, which is the bubble, which is really artificial and not generalizable. So I think that we just have to be, I think all of us who are managing sports at this time, most of our discussions have been related to processes. What do you do when you have a positive athlete? How do you control continued, how do you quarantine? How do you prevent further dissemination of disease and so forth? And we're not dealing with the sports injuries we were before. And I think that's really going to be the narrative we're going to have until, I'm going to guess, April, May, June. And that's because I don't think this thing's going to die out. I think it's with us. I would largely suggest that it's going to be what happens with the vaccine. And, you know, it's very unclear exactly when that's going to be. We have some close friends at Abbott. They say it's not happening until summer. I don't think anyone knows with certainty. But I would just say that we're not going to see a semblance of normalcy in sports, in contact sports especially, until probably June or July of next year. That's my guess. Obviously, it's really important from an economic perspective, from a society perspective, and we're going to see fits and starts. But I'm going to argue that if I had to predict what's going to happen, we're going to see a lot of starts and then some subsequent shutdowns because just the disease burden is going to rise. Not because necessarily people are sick and dying, but people will be sick, and the threat to the hospital system is really what we've always been watching, the so-called flattening the curve. So those are just some observations that we've had. We've both been I've been very involved in the NBA side. We've had independent baseball, who is, by the way, successfully has 12 teams that are playing 60 games done in September. They're still up and running, and they have fans, 400 to 500 fans that are coming into the stadiums. Right now, baseball, Nick, you can comment where you're at. I think the NFL is going to have a tough time, but we'll see what happens. High school is probably going to be non-existent in most places. That's my belief in terms of contact sports. So those of you who take care of high school teams, you kind of know what the writing's on the wall. Most of them are having trouble just getting in a classroom. And then college, I think, is just going to be postponed until the generalization is going to be postponed until the spring. Nick, any comments on that? And then baseball, what you think is going to happen?
Yeah, no, I think you made some great points, Brian. Unfortunately, where sports boils down to is pros and everybody else. And the difference is pros have basically a large pocketbook and huge resources and risk tolerance. The fact of the matter is these are professional. They're employed and compensated for what they do. They're willing to accept risk for the fact that, just the way that we're able to accept risk for the work that we do, they're able to accept risk for the work that they do as long as that risk is defined up front. Similar to your comments, I think, unfortunately, the risk tolerance in the world today is not at the point where we can really generate amateur sports, whether that's at the college level or the high school level. There's a lot that we don't know about the disease process going forward, the true risk to individuals. And I think that A, we're going to learn about the disease in the next 6 to 12 months. B, is we're potentially going to get better at treating the disease in the next 6 to 12 months. And C, is hopefully we'll have some way to protect vulnerable portions of the population, likely with a vaccine in that time frame as well. And I think those are the three things that are going to change the game going forward. So I think that your timeline of suspecting probably fall of next year as a restart to amateur sports is probably a very realistic one. I think all of us would be thrilled if we get there a little bit earlier, but I think that that's going to be a tough uphill climb. In terms of the MLB, obviously there have been some very public issues with one specific team, but the reality is, we've got we have 30 players on the active roster and another 30 on our taxi squads, and then all of the people that go around Major League Baseball in terms of participation. And we've really had one team that has had an issue. And so I think despite the fact that it's been a very public issue, we've been fairly successful, given that we're not quarantining, that we're not in a bubble, that we're operating in multiple cities, and that some of these cities exist in hotspots where COVID has been fairly prominent. I think that baseball is far enough in now that they'll get the season done. If they were to terminate a season, I think they'll go very quickly to a playoff model, potentially in a bubble situation if possible, because it's much easier to handle on a 16-team squad than it is on a larger squad when the entire team is playing. But as Brian said, the mainstay of this whole application has been testing and robust testing that happens every other day for baseball players, as well as conforming to some of the things that we know that works, which is hand washing, mask utilization, social distancing, and players being responsible. Not only players, but everybody who's within that team's operational status at this point, being somewhat responsible and thoughtful about how their activities may impact the greater team when they're away from the ballpark or away from club activities. So I think that's where we are now. It'll be very interesting to see how the NFL does. I think given that baseball has been somewhat successful, I think the NFL can be successful. The contact aspect of the sport certainly adds a little bit of a nuance to it, but I'm optimistic that they can get through some semblance of a season going forward.
One of a common question has been sort of how do we manage our athletes who test positive? The CDC has pretty firm recommendations, and every franchise and sport has taken it in a sort of nuanced way. But the general theme is that we know we're dealing with a 14-day exposure, but if you have repeat testing, you may be able to squeeze out getting an athlete back to play. But in general, most of us are not dealing with professional athletes. So you guys all know the basics, which is you sort of have this 14-day period in the absence of testing where we have the possibility of showing symptoms or being contagious. And then it's the 10-day period of having from the time and onset of symptoms, so no less than 10 days, and then 3 days without symptoms. And the biggest challenge we're having is, and we're seeing an evolution of how to manage athletes is that, and we've seen this already in some of our patients who are coming to surgery, once you've been positive, you still might continue to test positive despite not being infectious. So I think the general feeling is that if you have 3 days with absolutely no symptoms and you're 10 days from the onset of symptoms, you generally can return back to society and sports. The big challenge is how do you deal with, for example, someone who has continued loss of taste, some low-level symptom. In general, the belief is if you have 10 days that pass, and this is from the CDC, 10 days that pass from the symptom onset and 3 days without symptoms, you're not likely to be infectious. So those are some general guidelines, but a lot of this is handled through testing. But very few of us have readily have access to repeated testing. So those are the general guidelines we're seeing. And that's what's really the masses are going to adhere to when it comes to return to sport.
Brian, the other topic that came up a lot in questions and also in our list was social media. Do you want to give a quick 60-second thought process on how you use social media and what you would suggest for social media use for young guys?
Yeah. So I was honored. Someone did this research study, and I think Jim Lubowitz is on the webinar, where they looked at the influencers. It was kind of funny actually, because I've had people help me in full transparency. Like I always look at what's being posted, but it's been hard for me to stay on top of it. So I've had help. And again, another plug for AANA, we're doing this practice service organization. We're going to have an entire component this year on reputation management and social media. And I would argue that all of you need to have a robust website. All of you need to have search optimization, and you can't do it on your own. It's not your skill set. So plan to spend, if you really want to get into this, your day job is more important, but plan to spend a little bit of money. And I don't think you need to spend honestly more than between $5,000 and $10,000 a year for all in, just to have some footprint. And what's most important, what patients go to is your footprint, or your fingerprint, if you will, which is health grades and vitals and Google. And those are things that there are lots of tricks to get your name out there, including handing your patient's card saying, I'm so grateful that you've had a great outcome. It's been a pleasure and an honor to treat you. Would you mind going to this link and sharing your experience with our practice? I would tell you that no matter how patients get to us, they go to the internet almost uniformly to assess what the world thinks of you. And having a large number of reviews is probably the most important, and that's independent of Instagram and Twitter and Facebook and other. But I was selected from our efforts, and these are indirectly, as the #1 influencer last year in orthopedics. And it was based on this, looking at the index of from publications that were cited, but also Twitter. I think it was mostly Twitter, maybe a little bit of Facebook. And it was a kind of a funny study. And I would have never thought that I would have been that person. I'm sure next year I won't be, because people are way smarter at this than I am. But I would say that it's very difficult to do on your own. You got to figure out who your audience is going to be. And you really do need to separate your personal stuff from your work stuff. They're not the same audience. But I would not be afraid to reach out to get help in this domain. It's a little bit difficult to stay on top of. It's not hard to remain relevant. It may be hard to be #1 in this area, but it's not necessary to be #1, but you want to be present. And I'm not sure what the biggest movers are. I would say in priority, I would absolutely, if you've done nothing, focus on your internet reputation. I think that's the most important. And that's something you can build organically in your practice by giving patient a card, telling them where to go. On my website, I have a link that is linked directly to Google, Health Grades, Vitals, virtually every site that has the ability to rate your physician experience. And any patient who comes in who is complimentary and grateful, I give them that card and they go there. And maybe if 25% of them do it, that's better than 0. That is your best way to deal with this. Now, there's other companies, and we're going to be putting these on the AANA website for the PSO. This will be for member access, practice service organization, like Social Climb and others, and even Patient IQ is going to be doing this. So reputation management is #1. Instagram is cute. Facebook may be relevant. Twitter is maybe relevant, but I'm reluctant to say that those are movers for how patients come to you. I really believe that the average patient will Google best knee doc, best shoulder doc, best person to do SCR. And I would argue that doing research, relevant research, getting the word out there that you're an expert in the area, you can't be an expert in everything. And having patients have a good positive experience and getting that on the internet through reputation management is really where you need to be. It's kind of cute to have Instagram, all these other things, but I don't think they actually move the market, in my opinion. Nick, any comments?
Great comment, Brian. I would echo that. I think having a good website with a forward-facing public persona about who you are, what you do, and what your expertise is really critical in this day and age. So people can find you, they easily know how to get in touch with you, how to request an appointment, and to compare you to other physicians. And the second thing I would concentrate on is reputation management, because invariably that's what people look at is just like when you go to a hotel and you're on TripAdvisor, people are now looking at doctors and what people have to say about them. I will tell you that as you get further and further along in practice, and Brian would probably echo this, still the biggest practice development tool that we have is our satisfied patients. I would tell you 3 or 4 out of 5 patients that I see in the office as a new patient at this point is because I saw their neighbor or their friend or their coach or a high school teammate or somebody that had a good experience and recommended me personally to them. And that's still going to be your best bet in terms of building a practice going forward, is understanding that every patient that you see, whether they've got patellofemoral syndrome or whether you're young and doing grandma's hip in the ER because she's got a hip fracture, those are all practice building opportunities, and the way that you present yourself to your patients is going to be your #1 tool going forward. So just keep that in mind. I think we're at 7:02, Brian. I don't know if you have any.
I wanted to just raise a glass if those of you are still on the call. I'm really grateful that you took the time to do this. I know we're all sort of longing for some form of interaction. I almost wish that we could do this and have a video for all of us. It's kind of fun to see how everyone's doing, and maybe next time that's something we can do. But most importantly, I really want to wish all of you and your families continued health, patience. I'm really confident we're going to emerge from this and be fine. It does feel a little like Groundhog Day every day. Live for the moment, look at all the blessings we do have. We're very fortunate that we're all still working, and I'm hopeful that most of us have our health and our families have their health. And I also want to reiterate, my goal and Nick's goal this year for AANA as an organization who's hosting this is to provide something of real value like you're hearing tonight, but hopefully much better. And provide things that can help you in your practice, whether it's research or outcomes or reputation management or group purchasing, like really practical things. And has always been about techniques and the technical aspects of surgery, but it's really evolved into something that's can help you as an individual And layered on top of that is the journal and the excellence in research, the three journals, if you will. So I just hope you'll stay involved and engaged. And if there's anyone on this Zoom call that wants to be more involved, just email me. Nick and I are both our first initial B. Cole and Nick Verma, N Verma, or B Cole at rushortho.com. You know, we're both incredibly responsive. This is, to me, is a big family for both of us, and we look forward to ongoing communication. So again, thank you and stay safe. Cheers.
Cheers. Thanks, guys. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Dana, for putting this together.
Thank you, Anna, for organizing. Thank you very much. Have a great evening, everyone.